In the hushed corridors of Windsor Castle, where centuries of royal secrets whispered through ancient stones, Sarah Ferguson stood before an ornate mirror that had reflected the faces of queens and kings for generations. Her trembling hands smoothed the black fabric of a dress she had hoped never to wear again. Outside, the world mourned a monarch who had ruled for 7 decades. But inside these walls, a woman who had once been cast out from the very heart of this institution now faced the most difficult moment of her life. The invitation had arrived on cream-colored paper, bearing the royal seal that had once welcomed her as a bride and later witnessed her dramatic fall from grace. After years of scandal, divorce, and public humiliation, Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, had been summoned back to stand among the royals she had once called family. Queen Elizabeth II was gone, and with her passing, old wounds would be reopened, forgiveness would be tested, and a mother would have to explain to her daughters why their grandmother's funeral might be the last time the world would see them united as a family. This is not just the story of a funeral, but of redemption, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that survive even the deepest betrayals. It's the story of a woman who lost everything royal except her daughter's love, and how she found the courage to face a nation's judgment one final time. The morning of September 8th, 2022, began like any other autumn day for Sarah Ferguson in her modest Swiss chalet. The crisp mountain air carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of cowbells, a world away from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace where she had once lived as a princess. She was tending to her small garden, her hands dirty with soil, when her phone began to ring with an urgency that seemed to cut through the peaceful silence. The caller ID showed Princess Eugenie's number, and Sarah's heart immediately began to race. Her younger daughter rarely called so early, and there was something about the persistence of the ringing that filled her with dread. When she answered, Eugenie's voice was barely a whisper, choked with tears that Sarah could feel through the phone line. "Mummy, it's Granny. She's gone." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Queen Elizabeth II, the woman who had welcomed her into the royal family with warmth and kindness, who had stood by her through the early years of her marriage to Prince Andrew, and who had later watched with disappointment as Sarah's world crumbled in scandal, was dead. The Queen, who had ruled for 70 years with unwavering dignity, had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. Sarah sank into her garden chair, still holding the phone to her ear as Eugenie continued to speak through her tears. The arrangements were already beginning, she explained. The funeral would be held at Westminster Abbey, a ceremony that would bring together world leaders, members of the royal family, and millions of mourners from around the globe. And, yes, Sarah would be expected to attend. The invitation, when it arrived by special courier just hours later, was written on the same heavy cream paper that Sarah remembered from her wedding day 36 years earlier. The royal coat of arms pressed into the top of the page seemed to stare back at her with the weight of history. She traced the embossed letters with her finger, remembering the last time she had received such formal correspondence from the palace. That had been her divorce papers, delivered with the same ceremonial precision, but carrying a very different message. As she read the formal language requesting her presence at the funeral service, Sarah's mind wandered back to the early days when she had been welcomed into this world with open arms. She remembered her first Christmas at Sandringham, how nervous she had been to meet the Queen properly as Andrew's girlfriend. Elizabeth had been gracious and kind, asking about Sarah's work with charity organizations and seeming genuinely interested in her answers. There had been a moment during that first visit when the Queen had taken Sarah aside and told her quietly that she was glad Andrew had found someone who made him laugh. Those words had meant everything to Sarah then, and they echoed in her mind now as she contemplated returning to a world that had cast her out in disgrace. The years following her separation from Andrew had been brutal, filled with tabloid headlines that painted her as a money-hungry opportunist who had betrayed the royal family's trust. The infamous photographs of her with her financial advisor, the failed business ventures, the constant scrutiny of her every move, all of it had led to her gradual exile from the royal circle. But through it all, the queen had maintained a careful distance rather than complete rejection. There had been no public condemnation, no bitter statements to the press. Elizabeth had simply closed the door quietly, leaving Sarah to rebuild her life away from the spotlight that had once illuminated her every step. It was a mercy that Sarah had only come to appreciate with time and perspective. Now, sitting in her Swiss sanctuary, Sarah realized that this funeral would be more than just a goodbye to the queen. It would be her final appearance as a member of the royal family, a last chance to honor the woman who had shaped the destiny of her children and grandchildren. Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie were beloved granddaughters of the queen, and their mother's presence at the funeral was not just appropriate, it was necessary. The practical considerations began to overwhelm her as the reality of the situation set in. What would she wear? How would she navigate the complex protocol that governed every royal event? Most importantly, how would she face the cameras and the judgment of a world that had never quite forgiven her for her failures? Sarah called her stylist in London, a woman who had helped her through many difficult public appearances over the years. Together, they selected a simple black dress, elegant but not attention-seeking, paired with a traditional black hat with a modest veil. The outfit would need to strike the perfect balance between respect for the deceased monarch and acknowledgement of Sarah's unique position as both insider and outsider to the royal world. The next challenge was the logistics of her arrival. Sarah had not set foot in a royal residence for years, and the thought of navigating the complex security protocols and media attention filled her with anxiety. Her former protection officer, now working in private security, helped arrange discreet transportation and advised her on the best routes to avoid the most aggressive photographers. As evening fell on that first day after the Queen's death, Sarah found herself walking through her garden again, this time seeking solace in the familiar routine of watering her flowers. The international media had already begun their coverage of the Queen's death, and she knew that her own involvement in the funeral proceedings would soon become a subject of speculation and commentary. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends and former colleagues offering support and condolences. Some of the messages surprised her. They came from people within the royal household who had maintained contact despite her official separation from royal duties. Their words of comfort reminded her that her relationship with the institution had been complex, but not entirely without warmth. That night, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with memories of the woman whose death had summoned her back into a world she had left behind. She remembered the Queen's laugh, which was surprisingly hearty and infectious when she was relaxed and among family. She remembered Elizabeth's love for her horses and her dogs, how animated she became when discussing breeding lines and racing forms. Most of all, she remembered the Queen's unwavering sense of duty, a quality that had both inspired and intimidated Sarah during her years as a working royal. The realization that struck her most profoundly as she prepared for sleep was that this funeral would mark the end of an era in more ways than one. The Elizabethan age was over, and with it, the particular brand of royal duty and sacrifice that the Queen had embodied. A new reign was beginning under King Charles III, and Sarah understood instinctively that her place in this new order would be even more peripheral than it had been in the old one. But for now, none of that mattered. What mattered was honoring the memory of a remarkable woman who had dedicated her life to service and duty. What mattered was supporting her daughters as they grieved their beloved grandmother. And what mattered was finding the strength to face the world's scrutiny one more time with the dignity that the Queen herself would have expected. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah Ferguson began the mental preparation for what would undoubtedly be one of the most challenging days of her life. The Duchess of York was going home, not as the returning prodigal, but as a mother, a grandmother, and a woman who had learned to find her worth beyond the gilded walls of royal palaces. The morning would bring new challenges, but Tonight, she allowed herself to grieve for the woman who had been, in many ways, the closest thing to a mother she had known during her adult years. The journey back to London would begin tomorrow, but the real journey toward forgiveness, closure, and peace had already begun in the quiet sanctuary of her Swiss garden, surrounded by the flowers she had planted with her own hands and nurtured with the patience she had learned through years of exile and reflection. The private jet touched down at Heathrow Airport in the early hours of September 10th, carrying Sarah Ferguson back to a country she had left behind emotionally years ago, even though she had never truly departed physically. The familiar sight of the English countryside rolling beneath the aircraft windows brought a mixture of comfort and apprehension that settled heavily in her chest. She had requested that the pilot take the southern approach to the airport, allowing her one last glimpse of Windsor Castle in the distance, its ancient towers standing sentinel over the Thames Valley as they had for nearly 1,000 years. As the plane taxied to the private terminal, Sarah could see the increased security presence and the small gathering of photographers who had somehow learned of her arrival time despite the carefully guarded travel arrangements. The sight of those familiar telephoto lenses, waiting to capture her every expression, transported her immediately back to the darkest days of her public disgrace, when every stumble had been magnified into a headline, and every private moment had been fair game for public consumption. Her protection officer, a quiet professional named James who had worked with the royal family for decades, helped her navigate through the terminal with practiced efficiency. They had arranged for a discreet motorcade to take her directly to Royal Lodge, the Windsor estate property where Prince Andrew had continued to live following their divorce. It would be her first time returning to the house they had once shared as a married couple, a place filled with memories both joyous and painful. The drive through the English countryside was surreal in its normalcy. Village life continued as it always had, with people walking their dogs along country lanes and tending to their gardens, seemingly oblivious to the constitutional earthquake that had shaken the nation with the Queen's passing. Sarah found herself studying these scenes of everyday life through the tinted windows of her car, marveling at how different her existence had become from the simple pleasures of ordinary people. When the gates of Royal Lodge came into view, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The grand Georgian mansion sat majestically among perfectly manicured gardens, its cream-colored facade glowing in the morning sunlight. This had been her home for the happiest years of her life, where she had raised Beatrice and Eugenie, where she had hosted dinner parties for friends and family, where she had believed that her fairy tale marriage to Prince Andrew would last forever. Andrew was waiting for her at the front entrance, and the sight of him brought tears to her eyes. Her ex-husband had aged considerably since their last meeting, the stress of his association with the Jeffrey Epstein scandal having taken its toll on his appearance and demeanor. But in that moment, seeing him standing in the doorway of their former home, she was reminded of the young naval officer she had fallen in love with all those years ago. Their embrace was awkward at first, then surprisingly warm as the years of careful distance melted away in their shared grief. Andrew had lost his mother, the woman who had been the center of his universe and the source of his identity as the Queen's second son. Sarah had lost the only mother figure she had known since her own mother's death, and together they represented a complicated chapter in the royal family's modern history. Inside Royal Lodge, little had changed since Sarah's last visit several Christmases earlier. The same family photographs lined mantelpieces, including formal portraits from their wedding day and casual snapshots from family vacations with the girls when they were small. The Queen's presence was evident throughout the house in the form of gifts she had given them over the years. Crystal vases, silver picture frames, and a particularly beautiful set of Meissen porcelain that had been a wedding present. Beatrice and Eugenie arrived within hours of their mother's homecoming, both looking exhausted from the emotional toll of the past few days. The reunion between mother and daughters was tender and private, taking place in the morning room that overlooked the gardens where the girls had played as children. Sarah marveled at how poised and mature her daughters had become, both having inherited their grandmother's sense of duty and dignity despite the challenges of growing up in the public eye. The conversation naturally turned to the funeral arrangements and what would be expected of each family member during the various ceremonies. Eugenie, who had always been closer to the Queen than Beatrice, shared stories of her grandmother's final weeks at Balmoral, describing how peaceful and content Elizabeth had seemed in her beloved Scottish retreat. The Queen had continued to conduct audiences and sign documents almost until the end, her sense of duty never wavering even as her physical strength declined. As the family talked through the logistics of the coming days, Sarah began to understand the magnitude of the event they were about to participate in. The funeral would be broadcast to billions of people around the world, with every gesture and expression analyzed by commentators and royal watchers. Her own attendance had already generated headlines in the British press, with some questioning whether it was appropriate for the disgraced former Duchess to appear alongside working members of the royal family. The protocol meetings that followed were intensive and somewhat overwhelming. Sarah was briefed on exactly where she would sit during the service at Westminster Abbey, how she should conduct herself during the procession, and what her role would be during the private family burial at Windsor Castle later that day. Every detail had been planned with military precision, from the timing of her arrival at the Abbey to the specific car she would travel in as part of the funeral cortege. What struck Sarah most forcefully during these preparations was how much the royal family had changed since her departure from active duty. New faces appeared among the staff and advisors, young people who knew her only by reputation and approached her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The institutional memory of her years as a working royal had largely faded, replaced by the more recent narrative of scandal and exile that had defined her public image for so long. But there were also moments of unexpected warmth and recognition. Several longtime members of the household staff went out of their way to greet her kindly, sharing memories of happier times and expressing their condolences not just for the Queen's death, but for the difficulties Sarah had endured in the intervening years. These brief encounters reminded her that not everyone had written her off entirely, that some people remembered the enthusiastic young woman who had thrown herself into royal duties with genuine passion and commitment. The media attention intensified as the day of the funeral approached. Photographers stationed themselves outside the gates of Royal Lodge, hoping to capture images of the reunited family. Sarah found herself confined largely to the house and gardens, unable to venture out without triggering a feeding frenzy of camera shutters and shouted questions. The isolation was familiar but still unsettling, a reminder of the price that came with any association with the royal family, even a peripheral one. During quiet moments in the house, Sarah found herself drawn to the library where she and Andrew had spent many evenings in happier times, reading together while the girls did their homework nearby. The room was filled with books on naval history and royal biography, subjects that had fascinated Andrew throughout his life. Now these same books seemed to tell the story of an institution that had survived centuries of change and would continue long after all of them were gone. The weight of history pressed down on her as she prepared for what she knew would likely be her final appearance as any kind of royal family member. The new King Charles III had made it clear through various channels that the monarchy would be streamlined under his reign, with a smaller circle of working royals and less tolerance for the kind of peripheral figures that had characterized his mother's more inclusive approach. As the sun set over the grounds of Royal Lodge on the evening before the funeral, Sarah stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the gardens where her daughters had played as children. Tomorrow would bring challenges she could barely imagine, but tonight she allowed herself to remember the good times, the laughter, and the love that had once filled this house. Whatever happened in the coming days, she had her memories and the knowledge that she had raised two remarkable daughters who had never lost their connection to their royal heritage or their loyalty to their grandmother's memory. The Queen was gone, and with her passing, an entire era of British history had come to an end. Sarah Ferguson, the former Duchess of York, would have one final chance to say goodbye to the woman who had shaped her destiny in ways both wonderful and terrible. Tomorrow, she would step back into the spotlight she had left behind, not as a returning royal, but as a mother honoring the memory of her daughter's beloved grandmother. The alarm clock in Sarah Ferguson's temporary bedroom at Royal Lodge chimed softly at 5:30 in the morning on September 19th, 2022. She had been awake for hours already, lying in the pre-dawn darkness and listening to the distant sounds of preparation that had begun before sunrise. Outside, the security teams were conducting their final sweeps of the route to Westminster Abbey, while inside the house, the household staff moved quietly through their carefully rehearsed morning routine. Sarah rose from bed and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to reveal a gray London morning that seemed fitting for the somber day ahead. The weather forecasters had predicted rain, but for now the sky merely threatened, holding its moisture like unshed tears. In the distance, she could see the first television trucks positioning themselves along the route that the funeral procession would take through central London. The process of dressing for the funeral was both familiar and strange. Sarah had attended many state occasions during her years as a working royal, but none had carried the emotional weight of this final farewell. Her black dress hung in the wardrobe like a reminder of mortality, its simple elegance chosen specifically to avoid drawing attention while still showing appropriate respect. The matching hat, with its modest veil, would provide some protection from the cameras that would document every moment of the day. As she applied her makeup with careful precision, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror and was struck by how much she had aged since her last major royal appearance. The years of exile and personal struggle had left their mark, but there was also a strength in her face that hadn't been there during her younger, more turbulent years. She had survived scandal, financial ruin, and public humiliation, emerging with a deeper understanding of herself and her place in the world. Breakfast at Royal Lodge was a quiet affair, with Andrew, Beatrice, and Eugenie gathered around the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room. The normalcy of sharing toast and coffee together as a family provided a brief respite from the magnitude of what lay ahead. Conversation was minimal, each family member lost in their own thoughts about the woman they were about to lay to rest. The cars arrived precisely on schedule, their black exteriors gleaming despite the overcast sky. Sarah's protection officer reviewed the final security arrangements while the family prepared for departure. As they left Royal Lodge for the last time as a complete family unit, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure about this chapter of her life. Whatever happened after today, she would always have the memory of these final moments of unity with the people who mattered most to her. The journey into central London was surreal in its carefully orchestrated precision. The streets that would normally be bustling with morning traffic had been cleared for the funeral procession, creating an eerie silence broken only by the sound of their motorcades' engines and the distant hum of helicopters overhead. Police officers stood at attention at regular intervals, while crowds of mourners had already begun gathering behind the barriers that lined the route. As they approached Westminster, the scale of the event became apparent. Thousands of people had traveled from across the United Kingdom and around the world to witness this historic moment. Many had been camping on the streets for days, determined to secure a glimpse of the funeral procession and pay their respects to a monarch who had ruled longer than most of them had been alive. The sight of these devoted mourners reminded Sarah of the genuine love and respect the Queen had commanded throughout her reign. The arrival at Westminster Abbey was a carefully choreographed ballet of protocol and precedence. Each member of the royal family had been assigned specific timing and positioning, with Sarah's placement reflecting both her status as mother to the Queen's granddaughters and her complex relationship with the institution itself. She would sit with the extended royal family, but not in the front rows reserved for working royals and heads of state. Inside the ancient abbey, Sarah was overwhelmed by the majesty of the setting. Westminster Abbey had witnessed nearly 1,000 years of royal ceremonies, from coronations to weddings to funerals. The soaring Gothic arches and magnificent stained glass windows seemed to dwarf the human drama unfolding beneath them, providing a sense of perspective about the temporary nature of earthly concerns. The gathering of world leaders and dignitaries was unprecedented in its scope. Presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs from across the globe had come to pay their respects to Elizabeth II, recognizing her unique position as both head of state and symbol of stability in an increasingly uncertain world. Sarah found herself seated near other members of the extended royal family, many of whom she had not seen for years. When the Queen's coffin was carried into the Abbey by members of the Royal Navy, Sarah felt the full weight of the moment settle upon her. This simple wooden box, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, contained the remains of a woman who had dedicated 70 years of her life to the service of others. The sight of Prince Charles walking behind his mother's coffin, now King Charles III, brought tears to Sarah's eyes as she thought about the burden of responsibility that had passed to him. The service itself was a masterpiece of Anglican liturgy and royal tradition. The Archbishop of Canterbury delivered a sermon that spoke to the Queen's unwavering faith and dedication to duty, while the music provided by the choir filled the ancient space with transcendent beauty. Sarah found herself thinking not of the grand public figure being mourned, but of the private woman she had known, the grandmother who had delighted in her great-grandchildren's antics, the horse lover who could discuss breeding bloodlines for hours, the woman who had shown kindness to a young bride navigating the complexities of royal life. During the 2-minute silence that concluded the service, the entire abbey fell completely quiet except for the sound of muffled sobs and the distant tolling of Big Ben. In that profound silence, Sarah felt a connection to the millions of people around the world who were sharing this moment of grief and reflection. Despite her personal struggles and public failures, she was part of something larger than herself, connected to a tradition that stretched back centuries and would continue long after she was gone. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch was a spectacular display of British pageantry at its finest. The military bands, the horse-drawn gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin, and the solemn march of the royal family created images that would be remembered for generations. Sarah rode in one of the state cars with other family members, watching through the windows as hundreds of thousands of mourners lined the streets to say their final farewell to their beloved sovereign. The crowds were extraordinary in their diversity and devotion. Young children held flowers to throw in the path of the procession, elderly veterans stood at attention in their old uniforms, and people of every background and nationality waved small Union Jack flags or simply stood in respectful silence. The sight of this massive outpouring of love and grief reminded Sarah of the genuine connection the Queen had maintained with her people throughout her remarkable reign. At Wellington Arch, the coffin was transferred to the state hearse for the final journey to Windsor Castle. Sarah's role in the public ceremonies was now complete, but the most emotionally challenging part of the day still lay ahead. The private burial service at St. George's Chapel would be attended only by family members and close friends, providing an opportunity for more intimate farewells away from the cameras and crowds. The drive to Windsor was relatively quiet, with family members finally able to speak more freely after hours of formal protocol. Beatrice and Eugenie shared memories of their grandmother's final visit to Balmoral, describing how she had seemed at peace and ready for whatever lay ahead. Andrew spoke quietly about his mother's final conversation with him, in which she had expressed her love for all her children and grandchildren while acknowledging that her time was drawing to a close. As they approached Windsor Castle, Sarah felt a deep sense of coming full circle. This was where her royal story had truly begun, where she had spent countless Christmas celebrations and family gatherings, where she had watched her daughters grow up surrounded by the love and traditions of their extended family. Now would be where she said goodbye to the woman who had been the center of it all. The private burial service at St. George's Chapel was intimate and deeply moving, with only about 30 people present to witness the Queen's final farewell. Without the formal protocol and media coverage that had characterized earlier ceremonies, family members were free to express their grief more openly. Sarah found herself standing next to Princess Anne, with whom she had shared a complicated relationship over the years, but who now offered a supportive touch on her arm during the most emotional moments of the service. As the Queen's coffin was lowered into the royal vault, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary life that had just come to an end. Elizabeth II had inherited the throne as a young woman and had dedicated every day of the following 70 years to the service of her people. She had weathered personal tragedies, constitutional crises, and social changes that would have challenged anyone, maintaining her dignity and sense of duty throughout it all. The final moments of the burial were marked by the breaking of the Lord Chamberlain's wand of office and the removal of the crown jewels from the coffin, symbolic acts that marked the definitive end of the Elizabethan era. As these ancient rituals were performed, Sarah found herself thinking about legacy and the ways in which one life could touch so many others across decades and continents. When the service concluded and family members began to disperse, Sarah knew that her time as any kind of royal family member was effectively over. She had been granted the privilege of participating in this historic moment, but it represented closure rather than a new beginning. Tomorrow would bring a return to her private life, away from the spotlight and scrutiny that had defined so many years of her existence. The reception following the burial was held in the private apartments of Windsor Castle, spaces that Sarah remembered with crystal clarity from happier times, when family gatherings had been occasions of celebration rather than mourning. The Queen's sitting room, with its chintz-covered furniture and family photographs covering every available surface, now felt like a museum of memories rather than a lived-in space. The absence of Elizabeth's presence was palpable, as if the very soul of the castle had departed with its longtime resident. Sarah found herself standing near the window that overlooked the East Terrace Gardens, watching as her daughters moved gracefully through the gathering of family and close friends. Both Beatrice and Eugenie had inherited their grandmother's natural ability to make others feel comfortable during difficult moments, offering quiet words of support to younger cousins and elderly relatives who were struggling with their grief. Watching them, Sarah felt a profound sense of pride in the women they had become, despite the challenges of growing up in the fractured landscape of their parents' divorce and her subsequent exile from royal circles. The conversation in the room was subdued but warm, with family members sharing favorite memories of the Queen and discussing her lasting impact on their lives. Prince Charles, now firmly established as King Charles III, moved through the gathering with newfound gravitas, already beginning to embody the role he had spent his entire life preparing to assume. When he approached Sarah, their brief conversation was cordial but formal, acknowledging both their shared grief and the reality that her place in the royal family's future would be minimal at best. Princess Anne, whose relationship with Sarah had always been complex, surprised her by initiating a longer conversation about the Queen's final months and her thoughts on family unity. Anne's pragmatic nature had never allowed for the kind of dramatic emotional displays that had characterized some royal relationships, but her words carried genuine warmth as she acknowledged Sarah's devotion to her daughters and her respect for their grandmother's memory. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the dynamics around her. Conversations that included her gradually became shorter and more formal, as family members began to adjust to the new reality of Charles's reign and the streamlined monarchy he had long envisioned. It wasn't cruel or deliberate, but rather the natural evolution of an institution adapting to new leadership and changing times. The moment that would stay with Sarah forever came when she found herself alone for a few minutes in the Queen's private study. The room remained exactly as Elizabeth had left it, with official papers neatly stacked on the desk, reading glasses folded beside a half-finished crossword puzzle, and a small framed photograph of Prince Philip prominently displayed where she could see it while working. The intimacy of these personal details brought tears to Sarah's eyes, reminding her that beneath all the ceremony and protocol, they had just buried a beloved grandmother and friend. Among the papers on the desk, Sarah noticed a handwritten note in the Queen's distinctive script. Though she couldn't read the specific content from where she stood, the sight of that familiar handwriting, which had appeared on birthday cards and Christmas gifts for her daughters over the years, drove home the finality of what had happened. There would be no more personal notes from the Queen, no more quiet conversations about the girls' education or future plans, no more opportunities for the kind of reconciliation that Sarah had always hoped might eventually come. When it was time to leave Windsor Castle, the farewell process was handled with the same diplomatic precision that had characterized Sarah's entire relationship with the royal family since her divorce. There were warm embraces with her daughters, cordial handshakes with other family members, and polite expressions of gratitude for her presence during such a difficult time. But there was also an unmistakable sense of finality to these goodbyes, as if everyone understood that this represented the end of an era in more ways than one. The drive back to Royal Lodge gave Sarah time to process the emotional intensity of the day and begin planning for her immediate future. She would remain in England for a few more days to spend additional time with Beatrice and Eugenie, but then she would return to her quiet life in Switzerland, where she had built a new existence away from the relentless scrutiny of the British media. The contrast between her two worlds had never felt more stark than it did during that silent journey through the English countryside. That evening, back at Royal Lodge, the family gathered for a simple dinner that felt almost startling in its normalcy after the grand ceremonies of the day. They shared stories about the Queen that hadn't been included in the public tributes, laughing through their tears at memories of her unexpected sense of humor and her sometimes sharp observations about the people and events around her. These private moments of remembrance felt more authentic than the formal ceremonies, allowing them to grieve not just the monarch, but the grandmother and mother who had been the center of their family's universe. Andrew spoke movingly about his mother's final weeks, describing how she had used her time at Balmoral to reflect on her reign and express her hopes for the monarchy's future under Charles's leadership. She had been particularly concerned about maintaining the family unity that she had worked so hard to preserve despite various scandals and conflicts over the years. Her final conversations with her children had emphasized forgiveness, understanding, and the importance of putting family bonds above personal grievances. As Sarah listened to these intimate revelations, she was struck by the Queen's continuing concern for others, even as her own strength was failing. Elizabeth had spent her final weeks thinking not about her own legacy or comfort, but about the welfare of her children and grandchildren and the stability of the institution she had devoted her life to serving. This selflessness, which had characterized her entire reign, provided a powerful example of leadership and duty that would influence her family long after her death. The next morning brought a return to more practical concerns as Sarah began preparations for her departure from England. The media attention that had surrounded the funeral was beginning to subside, but there was still significant interest in her attendance and what it might signal about her future relationship with the royal family. Several journalists had requested interviews, but Sarah declined them all, preferring to let her presence at the funeral speak for itself rather than risk creating new controversies through ill-chosen words. Her final day at Royal Lodge was spent in quiet reflection and conversation with her daughters. Beatrice and Eugenie had both taken leave from their professional responsibilities to spend additional time processing their grief and supporting each other through this difficult transition. Their maturity and resilience impressed Sarah once again, reinforcing her belief that despite all the challenges of their upbringing, they had developed into remarkable young women with strong values and clear priorities. The conversation inevitably turned to the future and what it might hold for all of them. Under Charles's reign, the working royal family would become smaller and more focused, with less tolerance for the kind of peripheral involvement that had characterized some relationships during Elizabeth's more inclusive approach. Sarah's daughters would continue to have their royal titles, and their place in the line of succession, but their public roles would likely become even more limited than they already were. For Sarah herself, the path forward was clearer than it had been in years. She would return to Switzerland and continue building the quiet, purposeful life she had created away from royal obligations and media scrutiny. Her work with various charitable organizations would continue, but without the royal connection that had once defined her public identity. It was a prospect that brought more relief than sadness, representing freedom from expectations and obligations that had never felt entirely comfortable. The drive to Heathrow Airport for her departure was bittersweet, taking her past familiar landmarks that held decades of memories, both joyful and painful. The England she was leaving behind was entering a new chapter under King Charles III, while she was returning to a life that she had built entirely on her own terms. The contrast represented both an ending and a beginning, the close of one story and the opening of another. As her plane lifted off from the runway and climbed into the gray English sky, Sarah Ferguson looked down at the countryside where she had experienced some of the highest highs and lowest lows of her life. The Queen's funeral had provided closure not just on Elizabeth's remarkable reign, but on her own complicated relationship with the royal family and the institution that had shaped so many years of her existence. The woman who had once been the Duchess of York, who had lived in palaces and traveled the world as a representative of the British Crown, was returning to her Swiss chalet as simply Sarah Ferguson, author, charity worker, mother, and grandmother. It was a role that might lack the glamour of her former life, but it offered something far more valuable: authenticity, peace, and the freedom to define herself on her own terms. As the English coastline disappeared beneath the clouds, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. The Queen was gone, taking with her the last ties that had bound Sarah to a world that had never quite felt like home. What lay ahead was uncertain, but entirely her own, a future built on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and the unshakable love of her family. The final farewell to Queen Elizabeth II had become, unexpectedly, a farewell to Sarah's own past and a welcome to whatever came next. She was finally completely free. The Swiss chalet felt smaller somehow when Sarah returned, as if her brief re-entry into the world of royal protocol and grand gestures had altered her perspective on the modest sanctuary she had created for herself. The familiar scent of pine and the gentle sound of wind chimes on the terrace welcomed her home, but she found herself moving through the rooms with a restlessness that hadn't been there before her departure for London. The juxtaposition of her two worlds, the ancient grandeur of Windsor Castle and the simple comfort of her mountain retreat, had left her feeling slightly displaced in both. The first few days after her return were marked by an unusual quiet that seemed to echo the profound silence she had experienced during those 2 minutes at Westminster Abbey. International media coverage of the Queen's funeral continued to dominate news cycles around the world, with analysts and commentators dissecting every moment of the ceremony and speculating about the future of the monarchy under King Charles III. Sarah deliberately avoided most of this coverage, finding that the public interpretation of events felt disconnected from her own deeply personal experience of saying goodbye to someone who had been such a significant figure in her life. Her phone rang frequently with calls from friends and acquaintances who wanted to hear her perspective on the funeral and her thoughts about the royal family's future. Many of these conversations felt surreal, as people seemed to expect insights and insider knowledge that she no longer possessed. The reality was that her attendance at the funeral had been more about honoring her daughter's relationship with their grandmother than about any continuing connection to the inner workings of the royal household. The media attention gradually shifted away from Sarah's presence at the funeral toward other aspects of the transition to Charles's reign, but she was surprised by the lingering interest in her perspective on the Queen's legacy. Several book publishers reached out through her literary agent, suggesting that there might be public appetite for her memoir about her years within the royal family and her observations about Elizabeth, the second private character. The offers were substantial, but Sarah found herself reluctant to capitalize commercially on such recent grief, preferring to let her memories remain private treasures rather than public commodities. Instead, she channeled her energy into the charitable work that had become central to her identity in recent years. Her foundation focused on supporting young mothers in crisis situations, drawing on her own experiences of judgment and public scrutiny to help women who were facing similar challenges without the safety net of royal connections. The work felt more meaningful now than it ever had before, perhaps because she understood more clearly than ever the difference between genuine service and mere obligation. The autumn months passed peacefully in Switzerland, with Sarah developing new routines that helped her process the emotional impact of the Queen's death and her own final separation from royal life. She began writing again, not the memoir that publishers wanted, but personal reflections on loss, forgiveness, and the unexpected gifts that could emerge from life's most difficult chapters. These private writings were never intended for publication, but they helped her make sense of feelings that were too complex for casual conversation. Her relationship with Andrew entered a new phase during this period, with their shared experience of the funeral creating a deeper understanding between them than had existed for years. Their phone conversations became more frequent and more honest, discussing not just practical matters related to their daughters, but also their own feelings about the changes taking place within the royal family. They were both aging, both dealing with the reality that their time as significant figures in public life was drawing to a close, and both learning to find meaning in quieter, more private forms of contribution. Beatrice and Eugenie visited their mother in Switzerland during the Christmas holidays, bringing their own children and creating a multi-generational celebration that felt more relaxed and authentic than any royal Christmas at Sandringham had ever been. The sight of her granddaughters playing in the snow outside the chalet reminded Sarah of the simple pleasures that had been available to her all along, but which she had sometimes overlooked during her years of seeking validation through royal connections and public recognition. The conversations with her daughters during these holiday visits revealed how much they had been affected by their grandmother's death and by the reality of their changing position within the royal family. Both young women had developed successful careers and meaningful relationships outside of their royal titles, but they were still processing the loss of the stabilizing presence that the Queen had provided throughout their lives. Sarah found herself serving as both confidant and counselor, helping them navigate their grief while also encouraging their independence and self-reliance. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah began to notice that her dreams were changing. For months after the funeral, her sleep had been filled with vivid dreams about the Queen, some pleasant memories, and others anxious scenarios about royal protocol and media attention. Gradually, these dreams became less frequent and less intense, replaced by images of gardens, books, and quiet conversations with friends. The shift felt symbolic of her mind's acceptance that her royal chapter had truly ended and that her future lay in the life she was actively creating rather than in the past she had left behind. The first anniversary of the Queen's death approached with considerable media attention and public ceremony, but Sarah chose to mark the occasion privately, attending a small memorial service at a local church in Switzerland rather than accepting invitations to more prominent commemorative events in London. The simplicity of this choice felt right, honoring the Queen's memory in a way that was authentic to Sarah's current life, rather than attempting to recreate connections that no longer existed. During the memorial service, surrounded by neighbors and friends who knew her as simply Sarah rather than as the former Duchess of York, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected ways that loss could lead to liberation. The Queen's death had closed a door that had been slowly swinging shut for years, but in doing so, it had opened windows to possibilities that Sarah was only beginning to explore. Without the weight of royal expectations or the shadow of past scandals, she was discovering aspects of her personality and interests that had been suppressed for decades. The charitable work that had begun as a way to rebuild her reputation gradually evolved into something much more personally meaningful. Sarah began developing programs that addressed not just immediate crises, but long-term empowerment for women who had been marginalized by circumstances or poor choices. Her own experience of public judgment and personal failure became assets in this work, allowing her to connect with clients in ways that more conventional counselors might not achieve. As the second year after the Queen's death progressed, Sarah realized that she had stopped thinking of herself as an exile from royal life and had begun to embrace her identity as someone who had chosen a different path. The distinction was subtle but important, representing a shift from victim to agent in her own story. Rather than being someone who had been cast out, she was becoming someone who had found her way to where she belonged. The correspondence with her daughters evolved as they all adjusted to their new normal. Letters and phone calls became less focused on royal obligations and more centered on personal growth, professional achievements, and family milestones. Sarah found herself offering advice based on her own hard-won wisdom about resilience, authenticity, and the importance of defining success on personal rather than public terms. Her writing continued to develop during this period, but in directions she hadn't anticipated. Rather than focusing solely on her royal experiences, Sarah began exploring themes of reinvention, forgiveness, and the courage required to start over in midlife. These essays and reflections remained private, but the process of writing them helped her articulate insights that had emerged from years of challenge and reflection. The international media attention that had once defined so much of her existence became increasingly irrelevant to Sarah's daily life. Occasionally, her name would surface in connection with royal stories or anniversaries, but these mentions felt like echoes from someone else's life rather than current realities. The freedom from constant scrutiny allowed her to develop friendships and interests that had nothing to do with her former status, creating a social circle based on shared values and genuine affection rather than protocol and hierarchy. As she approached her 64th birthday, Sarah Ferguson found herself in a place she had never expected to reach, genuine contentment with a life built entirely on her own terms. The woman who had once been desperate for royal acceptance and public validation had discovered that the most meaningful accomplishments were often the quietest ones, achieved away from cameras and commentary. The Queen's funeral had represented many things: the end of an era, the close of a remarkable reign, and the final severing of Sarah's formal ties to the royal family. But perhaps most importantly, it had marked the beginning of her most authentic chapter, a time when she could honor Elizabeth II's memory not by seeking to reclaim past roles, but by embodying the values of service, dignity, and resilience that the Queen had modeled throughout her extraordinary life. In her Swiss chalet, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed her transformation from exile to free woman, Sarah Ferguson had found something more valuable than any title or royal connection: peace with herself and confidence in the future. She was creating one quiet, purposeful day at a time.